Wrong seat, kid. That's how it started. A teenage girl, valid first-class ticket clutched in her sweaty palm, facing down a flight attendant with ice water in her veins. Humiliation bloomed, hot and fast. Back of the bus for you. Everyone watched, silent, cowards. But Tasha, she didn't cry. She didn't even argue. Just a quick text to her godmother, Evelyn. Big mistake, Parker. Huge. See, what the airline doesn't know, what that smug flight attendant will soon find out, is that Evelyn isn't just some PTA mom. She's got teeth, and she ain't afraid to bite. Kindness coiled tight, ready to spring. This flight? Grounded. Justice is about to be served. Cold. Within minutes, the engines were shut off. The captain stopped the flight and federal officers were on their way. What the airline didn't know, she wasn't just any passenger. She was the reason the entire flight would be grounded. Before we start the story, comment below and tell us where in the world you're watching from today. And if you enjoy this kind of story, make sure to subscribe and turn on the bell icon so you never miss the next one. She sat quietly in seat 3B, her hands folded over a navy blue backpack resting on her lap. Her name was Tasha, a 16-year-old with a calm face and tired eyes. She had boarded early, her ticket tucked safely inside the sleeve of her hoodie. This was her first time flying alone, and even though she was a little nervous, she felt proud. Her godmother, Evelyn, had gifted her the first-class ticket after she finished a science program with top scores. The seat was wide and soft. The cabin smelled clean, and everything felt peaceful. She didn't talk to anyone. She just looked out the window, watching the runway, her headphones resting around her neck and a book unopened in her lap. Passengers were still boarding. A man in a suit was mumbling into his phone across the aisle. A flight attendant helped someone with their suitcase a few rows down. Then another woman appeared, older, sharp-faced, stiff in posture. Her name tag read Ms. Parker, and her heels clicked loudly on the cabin floor as she moved up the aisle, glancing from seat to seat. Her steps slowed when she reached Tasha. She stopped completely. For a second, her eyes held a smile, but it faded the moment she took a closer look. "You're in the wrong seat," Miss Parker said, her tone flat but loud enough for others to hear. Tasha turned to her puzzled. "No, I think this is my seat," she said quietly. Miss Parker's eyes narrowed. "This is first class," she added, her voice rising slightly. "Where are your parents?" The question echoed in the cabin. A few passengers turned their heads. Tasha pulled her boarding pass from her pocket and held it out. "I'm in 3B, she said. Ms. Parker took the pass, scanned it quickly, and raised an eyebrow. She looked back at Tasha like something didn't add up. "This must be a mistake," she said. "There's no way." She caught herself, then hardened her voice. "You need to move now." Tasha blinked. "But I have a first-class ticket," she said again, a little firmer this time. Miss Parker didn't back down. She leaned slightly forward, placing one hand on her hip. "I don't know how you got this ticket, but you're holding up the boarding process. You need to take your things and move to the back." The tone of her voice was no longer firm. It was dismissive, cold, and loud. Passengers nearby looked uncomfortable. Some avoided eye contact. Others watched like it was a scene on TV. Tasha's face burned. She wanted to speak to explain, but she saw it clearly. No one was going to help. So she stood, grabbed her backpack, and walked down the long aisle toward economy. Her head was low. Her chest felt tight. She didn't cry. She wouldn't. In the back of the plane, she found an empty seat by the window. She sat down, placed her bag at her feet, and stared out at the tarmac. She could still feel Ms. Parker's voice in her ears, sharp and loud, as if she'd done something wrong. She hadn't. She had followed every rule. She had earned this trip. She had been proud. But none of that mattered. She pulled out her phone and opened her messages. Her fingers moved slowly. "She made me leave my seat." She typed, said I didn't belong. "I'm in the back now." She hit send and locked the screen. She didn't know what her godmother would say. She didn't even know if anything could be done. But as she stared out the small window, she had one thought. This flight wasn't going anywhere. Not if Evelyn had anything to do with it. Tasha's phone vibrated only seconds after her message was delivered. She glanced down, expecting a short reply. Instead, it was just two words. What happened? Her stomach flipped. She could almost hear Evelyn's voice through the screen. Steady, calm, but unmistakably serious. Tasha hesitated, then typed slowly, her thumbs pressing harder than usual against the glass. Flight attendant made me move. She didn't believe the ticket was mine. She said I couldn't be in first class. The message bubble sat for a moment. Then another came through. Short, sharp, clear. Flight number. Tasha reached into her hoodie again and pulled out the crumpled boarding pass. Her fingers trembled slightly now, not from fear, but from the rush of everything that had just happened. She typed the flight number and hit send. The reply came within seconds. Stay where you are. Do not speak to anyone else. I'll handle it. Tasha stared at those words for a long time. She'd seen her godmother fix things before, at family events, in meetings, even once during a school issue. But this felt different. They were already in the airfield, taxiing toward takeoff. What could she possibly do now? A strange calm settled over her, though. Not because she believed everything would magically fix itself, but because when Evelyn said she'd handle it, she meant it. At the front of the plane, Miss Parker stood in the galley, sipping water from a paper cup. She looked pleased. Her lips curled slightly as she straightened a stack of napkins. The other attendants moved quietly around her, most avoiding her eyes. One of them, a younger man named Luis, finally stepped closer, lowering his voice. Hey, about the girl earlier, he started. Miss Parker didn't let him finish. What about her? She had the ticket, Luis said. I saw it. It looked real. Miss Parker let out a quiet laugh. Lots of things look real. I've been doing this for 15 years. You learn to spot when something's off. Louise shifted uncomfortably. She wasn't causing any trouble. She was in the wrong seat. Miss Parker snapped. I fixed it. Louise said nothing else. He just stepped back. Miss Parker sipped the last of her water and tossed the cup away, the smug expression still on her face. But she didn't know what had just been set in motion. She didn't know that Tasha's godmother wasn't just a successful woman with connections. She was Evelyn Brooks, Director of Aviation Safety at the Federal Aviation Authority. And Evelyn didn't take humiliation lightly. Back in the cockpit, the pilot's phone lit up. A direct message from the ground control line marked URGNT. He picked up the line and frowned as he listened. The instructions were clear. Hold the plane. Do not taxi to runway. An official compliance concern had been raised, tied to a passenger on board. Sir? His co-pilot asked. The captain shook his head slowly. We're not going anywhere yet. He picked up the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, we've been asked to remain at the gate a little longer due to a minor delay. We'll update you shortly. The passengers groaned softly. Most didn't think twice. Delays happened. No one questioned it. But for Tasha, it was the first sign that something was shifting. And for Ms. Parker, it was the beginning of a storm she never saw coming. Tasha sat still in the cramped economy seat, staring at the seatbelt sign as it blinked above her. She didn't move. She didn't speak. The message from her godmother echoed in her head over and over. Stay where you are, I'll handle it. She could feel the energy in the cabin begin to shift. A few passengers were checking their watches. Others whispered to one another, wondering why the plane hadn't taken off. But no one looked at her. No one said a word. Meanwhile, in the front cabin, Miss Parker moved down the first-class aisle with forced grace. She offered a tight smile here, a polite nod there, pretending everything was fine. She stopped at seat 3B, now empty, and adjusted the headrest as if that could erase what had happened just minutes earlier. One of the passengers, a woman with silver hair and a pearl necklace, leaned slightly toward her. What's the holdup? She asked. Miss Parker gave a carefully measured smile. So just a small delay. Should be resolved soon. She moved on quickly, not waiting for a reply. Inside, she felt the first flicker of discomfort. She glanced toward the cockpit door, but didn't move toward it. Something didn't feel right. She straightened the folded blankets at an empty seat, trying to keep her hands busy. In the cockpit, the captain tapped his fingers on the armrest. He had just gotten off a second call. This one from someone he wasn't used to hearing from directly, a representative from the FAA. Not a routine call, not a simple inquiry. The words were still fresh in his ears. There's a complaint filed by Director Evelyn Brooks regarding an onboard passenger. You are to remain grounded until further notice. She wants answers immediately. The captain had flown for over 20 years. He dealt with engine faults, airspace routes, even aggressive passengers, but he had never received a call from someone like Evelyn Brooks. Her name carried weight, not just in aviation, but in government oversight. If she said, "Stop the plane, you stop the plane. Contact your senior cabin crew," the voice had said. She'll need to explain why a first-class passenger with a valid ticket was removed from her seat without cause. The captain hung up, stood, and opened the cockpit door. "Miss Parker," he called, his voice calm but clipped. She turned around. "Yes, Captain. Step up here, please." Passengers nearby glanced up. Miss Parker's smile faltered. She smoothed her blouse with both hands and made her way toward the front. Inside the cockpit, the door closed behind her. The captain didn't speak right away. He motioned to the headset where a voice from the ground was already waiting. She placed it on her head, confusion in her eyes. "Miss Parker," the voice began, "this is James Sandler, FAA Operations Manager, speaking on behalf of Director Evelyn Brooks." She froze. "We've been notified that a passenger, Tasha Holloway, was removed from her first-class seat under your instruction. We are currently investigating the validity of that action." Ms. Parker's voice caught for a moment. She didn't appear to be a first-class passenger. "I was following protocol. Did you scan her ticket?" I looked at it. "That's not what I asked." The silence that followed was sharp. The voice on the line didn't change tone. "Did you verify her boarding pass with the manifest or ground agents before removing her?" Ms. Parker's hands grew clammy. "No, but I made a judgment based on the situation." "You made a judgment based on what she looked like," the voice said flatly. The captain stood to the side, arms crossed. He didn't interrupt. Miss Parker swallowed hard. Her throat felt dry, her chest tight. "You're to return to the passenger immediately," the voice continued. "Escort her back to first class, apologize clearly, and in front of other passengers. This flight will not move until that is done." "And after that?" she asked, barely a whisper. "After that," the voice replied, "we'll be waiting when you land." The line went dead. Miss Parker took the headset off with shaking fingers. For the first time in her career, she didn't know how to fix what she'd just broken. Miss Parker stepped out of the cockpit slowly, her face pale and her steps unsteady. The confident stride she had earlier was gone. She avoided eye contact with the first-class passengers as she passed them, her hands fidgeting with the edge of her uniform. Each step down the aisle felt heavier than the last. She could feel the weight of the cabin's silence pressing down on her. Everyone was waiting for the flight to move, waiting for an explanation, though no one yet knew the real reason they were still grounded. As she neared the economy section, her eyes searched the rows until they landed on Tasha, who was still sitting quietly by the window. The girl hadn't moved. Her backpack was tucked neatly under the seat again, her arms folded across her lap. She stared out the window, calm on the outside, but her mind was spinning. She had no idea what was going to happen next, but she knew something had changed. She could feel it in the tension of the cabin, in the looks being exchanged between crew members, and now in the awkward presence of Ms. Parker approaching her seat. M. Parker crouched slightly, forcing a strained smile. "Miss Holloway," she began, her voice lower than before, but still tight. "There seems to have been a misunderstanding. I'd like to escort you back to your original seat." Tasha turned her head slowly, her face unreadable. She didn't move. She didn't speak right away. Miss Parker's forced expression began to falter. "I apologize for the confusion," she added quickly, "and for any inconvenience caused." Tasha blinked, then tilted her head slightly. "Confusion," she said quietly. Miss Parker nodded, her face tightening. There was an error in seating. Tasha didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her words cut in a quiet, firm tone. "You checked my ticket. You saw the seat number. And you still told me to move." A few passengers nearby turned their heads subtly. The ones who had heard the earlier commotion now listened closely, their interest suddenly sharper. Miss Parker shifted her weight from one foot to the other, her hands stiff at her sides. "I may have made a mistake in judgment," she said carefully. Tasha watched her for a moment, then looked down at her phone. She typed a short message and hit send. "She's here," Says it was a mistake. A reply came almost instantly. Make her say it. Tasha put her phone back in her pocket and stood up slowly. She turned to face Miss Parker, who straightened up as she did. I'll go back, Tasha said, her voice steady. But I want to know something. Miss Parker tensed. Why did you assume I didn't belong in that seat? You didn't ask anyone else for their ticket. Just me. Why? The question hung in the air like a spotlight. Miss Parker opened her mouth, but nothing came out. The nearby passengers stared openly now. Some shifted in their seats. Others stopped pretending not to listen. Tasha didn't look away. She held her gaze. If you're going to apologize, she said, say what you really did. Miss Parker's lips parted, but her voice caught in her throat. This was unfamiliar ground. She had never been on this side of a conversation, never had to explain herself like this. Her hands felt cold. I misjudged you, she finally said. Tasha didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She nodded once, then picked up her backpack. The two of them walked back up the aisle together, one in silence, the other under the full weight of watching eyes. And as they entered the first-class cabin again, passengers turned. Some looked surprised, others looked away, ashamed. Tasha returned to seat 3B and calmly placed her bag back beneath her feet. She sat down, folded her hands in her lap, and stared straight ahead. Miss Parker stood beside her, unsure what to say next. If there's anything you need, she mumbled, please let me know. Tasha opened her book without looking up. The conversation was over. Miss Parker turned and walked back up the aisle, her face flushed, her steps quick and uneven. She disappeared into the galley like a shadow slipping out of sight. The moment she left, a strange hush settled over the first-class cabin. People avoided looking at Tasha, but their silence said everything. She could feel the shift, not just in the flight, but in how she was being seen. A few hours ago, they didn't even notice her. Now they couldn't stop glancing in her direction, pretending they weren't. Tasha leaned back in her seat and took a breath. She still felt the pressure in her chest, but it was different now. The fear had faded, replaced with something stronger, control. Not power in the loud sense, but quiet, steady strength. She opened her book again and stared at the page, though she wasn't reading. Her eyes were focused, but her thoughts ran elsewhere. Across the aisle, a man in a navy blue blazer cleared his throat. He leaned over slightly, his voice low. I saw what happened earlier, he said. Tasha didn't turn her head. She kept her eyes on the page. Did you? He nodded awkwardly. It was unfortunate. She finally looked up, one eyebrow raised. Unfortunate. He shifted in his seat. Yes. Well, clearly a misunderstanding. She studied him for a second, then gave a small, controlled smile. You mean it was a choice? The man opened his mouth, then closed it again. His fingers tightened around the armrest, and he slowly leaned back into his seat without saying another word. Tasha went back to her book, flipping the page, even though she hadn't finished the last one. Her phone buzzed in her lap. She glanced at it. Another message from Evelyn. Sit back and relax. I'm not done yet. She didn't respond. She just turned the phone face down and exhaled slowly. In the galley, Miss Parker leaned over the counter, gripping it with both hands. Her breathing was shallow, her mind racing. She had walked passengers out before. She had handled angry customers, ignored complaints, enforced rules without flinching. But none of those moments came back to haunt her the way this one already was, because this time, she hadn't just kicked someone out of a seat. She had exposed something uglier. And now she was being watched. Her fellow flight attendant, Louise, stepped into the galley behind her. He didn't say anything at first. He just stared for a moment, then finally spoke. You really messed up, he said. Miss Parker didn't answer. She's not just some kid, Louise added. Do you know who her godmother is? I know now, she muttered, her throat dry. Louise folded his arms. Then you know this isn't going to stop at an apology. Miss Parker turned her head slightly, her eyes hollow. I did what I thought was right. No, he said quietly. You did what you assumed. She looked away, her jaw tightening. Back in the first-class cabin, Tasha took another sip of water. The silence around her had changed. It wasn't ignoring her anymore. It was filled with discomfort. Everyone knew what had happened. Everyone had seen how she was treated. And now they were being forced to sit with the truth that they had done nothing. Not one of them had spoken up. Tasha wasn't angry. Not anymore. She was watching, and she knew this was far from over. The plane still hadn't moved. Passengers began to notice. The soft mechanical sounds that usually signaled pushback were missing. No rumble of engines. No announcements about takeoff. Just silence broken by occasional whispers and impatient sighs. A few passengers rang the call buttons. One elderly man removed his earbuds and glanced out the window, confused. A woman with a tablet muttered something under her breath and flagged down Louise as he passed by. "Is there a delay?" she asked. Louise nodded. "We've been asked to hold at the gate a bit longer. The captain will update everyone shortly." He smiled politely and kept walking, but the worry in his eyes didn't match the reassurance in his voice. In the cockpit, the captain sat back in his chair, arms folded, eyes focused on the instrument panel he wasn't allowed to touch yet. The call from the FAA still echoed in his ears. Evelyn Brooks herself had demanded answers, and when someone at her level spoke, people listened. Hard decisions weren't coming from the airline's customer support team anymore. They were coming from the top of the aviation authority. A few moments later, the in-flight phone buzzed again. He answered quickly. The voice on the other end was calm but firm. "Captain Monroe, we've received additional orders from FAA operations." "Go ahead," he replied. "The incident has been escalated. You are not cleared for departure. The passenger in question has been returned to her seat, but a compliance officer will be meeting the aircraft at landing. You are to maintain full records of crew actions and passenger reports during the flight." The captain blinked. "FAA is sending someone to meet us." "That's correct. This isn't just an internal complaint. It's now marked as a priority incident. The crew member involved will be interviewed immediately upon landing." The line went silent. Captain Monroe placed the receiver down slowly and turned to glance at the cabin door. He had flown senators, CEOs, foreign diplomats, but he had never seen a flight held back for one girl in seat 3B. Back in the galley, Miss Parker stood motionless. The quiet around her felt louder than anything she had ever heard midair. Her stomach turned. She had received passenger complaints before. People unhappy with food, unhappy with delays, unhappy with not getting an upgrade. But this was different. This wasn't a complaint. This was a consequence. She stepped out into the aisle again, trying to maintain her posture, but the weight in her chest was growing. Her eyes flicked toward first class. Tasha sat calmly, her legs crossed at the ankle, her hands resting on her lap. She wasn't smiling. She wasn't staring back. She was simply present, and somehow that was worse. Miss Parker started walking forward, then stopped midway as Louise stepped into her path. He leaned closer, speaking low so only she could hear. "They just called from the flight deck. FAA is sending someone to meet us when we land." Her eyes widened. "What?" "You heard me," Louise said. "You're going to have to explain everything to them." Miss Parker's breath hitched. "I apologized. She's back in her seat." Louise didn't blink. "That's not what this is about anymore." Miss Parker stepped back like she'd been pushed. Her mind raced. All the years she'd worked, the promotions she had earned, the reputation she had built as someone who kept order in the cabin. It had never crossed her mind that one choice, one moment of assumption, could put it all at risk. But now she could feel it slipping in her head. She replayed the moment over and over. The raised voice, the dismissive tone, the quick decision to remove Tasha without checking the manifest. At the time, it had felt like standard procedure. Now it looked like something else. Discrimination, bias, abuse of authority. Words she never imagined would be linked to her name were now circling like shadows. Louis lowered his voice one last time. "They're going to ask you why you didn't question anyone else. Be ready." He walked away, leaving Miss Parker standing alone in the aisle. The glances from passengers pierced through her. She wasn't in control anymore. The uniform that once gave her authority now felt like a target on her back. And up ahead, Tasha remained silent. She didn't need to say a word. Everything was already being said without her. The captain's voice crackled through the cabin, speakers calm and practiced, but with a weight that made people listen closely. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We've been advised to delay our departure due to a required compliance check. We apologize for the inconvenience and appreciate your patience. We'll be underway as soon as we're cleared by ground control." There was a pause. A few people muttered. Some sighed, but no one yet understood what kind of compliance check this really was. Tasha sat motionless, eyes steady, but her heart beat faster now. The pieces were moving. Her godmother didn't make threats. She made decisions. And this wasn't just about an apology anymore. Something bigger was happening. She reached down and pulled her phone from her bag. Another message lit up the screen. "Evelyn, the FAA board has flagged the flight. They're logging every crew action now. If anything else happens, tell me immediately." Tasha read the message, then turned off the screen and placed the phone gently back into her lap. She wasn't afraid anymore. She was watching, listening, learning, and she was ready. In the galley, Miss Parker paced in a tight line, her palms damp, the pit in her stomach growing deeper by the minute. She had hoped the captain's announcement would settle things, but instead it made the air heavier. Her thoughts jumped around wildly. What would she say when questioned? That she thought the girl was in the wrong seat? That she was just following orders? That she had made an honest mistake? None of it would hold up. Not when there were witnesses, not when the captain had spoken directly to the FAA, not when she had been the only crew member to approach that one passenger and question only her. Luis leaned into the galley again. "You should go sit down before you faint," he said flatly. "I'm fine," she snapped, though her voice cracked. "No, you're not. You've been in this job long enough to know this doesn't blow over. You might as well start thinking about what you're going to say when we land, because someone in a suit is going to ask you to explain exactly what you saw that made you drag a teenager out of a first-class seat." "I didn't drag her. You humiliated her," Lewis interrupted. "And you're only sorry now because someone important noticed." The words hit harder than she expected. She looked away. Lewis didn't add anything else. He just walked out and left her to the silence. At the front of the cabin, passengers had begun murmuring again. The delay was stretching. One woman stood to use the restroom and passed by Tasha's seat. She paused for a second, just long enough to make eye contact. She didn't speak, but the expression on her face said more than words could. "I saw. I didn't do anything. And I know it." Tasha held her gaze only for a moment, then returned her attention to the window. Outside, the ground crew moved slowly, waiting for clearance that hadn't come. Inside, tension built with every second. The man in seat 2C, a marketing executive with an expensive watch and a trembling leg, finally spoke up to the woman beside him. "They must be checking the plane." She gave a small shake of her head. "It's not the plane." "Well, what else could it be?" he asked. She hesitated, then nodded toward Tasha. "It's her." He followed her gaze, his face tightening with realization. "She's the reason we're still on the ground," the woman added. "You didn't see what the flight attendant did earlier, did you?" He looked guilty. "Number I was on a call." "Well," she said, voice low, "you missed something ugly." Passengers were beginning to understand that this wasn't mechanical, it wasn't technical, it was personal, and it was being handled by someone with enough power to freeze an entire aircraft in place. Tasha wasn't the same girl who had been sent to the back of the plane. She wasn't nervous anymore. She wasn't confused. She was centered, grounded, like the plane around her. And Ms. Parker, she was falling apart behind the curtain. The very silence she had used to control passengers for years now surrounded her, and it had never felt louder. The tension in the cabin thickened with every passing minute. What had started as a routine flight now felt like the inside of a courtroom, silent, charged, and waiting for a verdict. Tasha didn't move. She kept her posture calm, shoulders square, legs still. She wasn't trying to look powerful. She simply refused to look small. In the galley, Miss Parker sat on a metal jump seat, elbows on her knees, forehead resting in one palm. She hadn't checked the time. She hadn't spoken to anyone since Louise walked away. Her thoughts played like broken audio in her head, snippets of conversations, her own voice echoing back at her. "Where are your parents? You don't belong here. Move to the back." She had said it all out loud in front of people without hesitation. At the time, it felt like control. Now it sounded like evidence. She finally looked up when the phone near the galley buzzed. A crew member picked it up and passed it to her with a glance. Miss Parker pressed it to her ear. The voice on the other end was cool and unfamiliar. "This is Devin Mercer, senior investigator with the FAA. Ms. Parker." Her throat tightened. "Yes, we've received your name in a report concerning an incident on Flight 263. I need to inform you that upon landing, you'll be escorted to a separate area for formal questioning." Miss Parker didn't respond. "This will not be optional," the voice added. "Please do not speak further with the passenger involved. Any additional comments may be included in the investigation record." She nodded, though he couldn't see her. "Understood," she whispered. The line clicked off. She set the phone down slowly and leaned back against the wall, letting out a breath she didn't realize she was holding. Her hands were shaking now, the kind of shaking you can't control, the kind that starts in your chest and spreads without warning. She wasn't being corrected. She was being investigated. Across the plane, passengers began whispering with more purpose now. Something had shifted, something real. A few people were quietly putting pieces together, while others sat stiffly in their seats, hoping no one asked them what they had seen or failed to do. Luis walked past first class again and glanced at Tasha. She looked at him briefly, then back out the window. He didn't stop. He didn't say anything, but his silence carried a kind of respect. Not pity, not sympathy, just a quiet acknowledgement of someone who had endured something and never once raised her voice. At the front of the plane, the cockpit door opened again. Captain Monroe stepped out and walked slowly down the aisle toward the galley. He stopped in front of Ms. Parker, his expression unreadable. "They're meeting us on the tarmac. Security will escort you first," he said. She nodded. Her eyes didn't rise. "They've also requested a full statement from all cabin crew," he added, including passengers seated nearby. "I understand," she said, barely audible. "Good," he replied, then turned to leave. He paused for a moment and added, "I suggest you think about what you're going to say. Carefully." As he walked away, Miss Parker sank lower in her seat. Every second stretched like an hour. Back in seat 3B, Tasha checked her phone again. A new message appeared. "Evelyn, FAA security will meet the plane. You'll be the last to leave. Just stay calm." She typed a quick reply. "I'm fine. Just watching everything." And she was watching the quiet glances, watching the weight of silence shift from her shoulders to everyone else's, watching Ms. Parker unravel behind the curtain she used to control. This wasn't a tantrum. It wasn't revenge. It was accountability wrapped in silence. And the longer the plane sat unmoving on the ground, the clearer it became to everyone on board. This wasn't just a delay. It was justice. The cabin remained unnaturally quiet as the plane continued sitting motionless at the gate. The usual sounds of takeoff, the engine rumble, the flight crew's cheerful announcements, the comforting bump of wheels pulling back from the bridge never came. Time stretched. Every minute on the tarmac only deepened the sense that something far more serious was unfolding. Tasha sat still, her phone resting face down on her tray table. She wasn't scrolling. She wasn't messaging anymore. She didn't need to. Every part of her could feel the shift in atmosphere. The same passengers who had ignored her now sat tense, exchanging uneasy looks, too aware of her presence to pretend she wasn't there. The man who had earlier called the delay unfortunate now avoided her gaze entirely. Even the woman beside him sat with her hands clasped tightly in her lap, the screen of her tablet untouched. The silence wasn't just awkward. It was heavy, exposing, and no one wanted to be the first to speak. At the rear of the plane, Miss Parker stood in the galley, still frozen in place. Her breathing was shallow. She kept glancing at the curtain as if trying to decide whether to walk back through it or disappear behind it. Her hands were damp, her thoughts looping without pause. 10 years. That's how long she had worn that uniform. 10 years of flight hours, promotions, control. She had believed her instincts were enough, that a glance could tell her what kind of passenger someone was. What she didn't see until now was how that same instinct had led her straight into the worst mistake of her life. She thought she was protecting order, but what she had really protected was her own assumption. Louis returned to the galley, his arms crossed. He didn't speak right away. He simply watched her for a moment. Miss Parker turned toward him, her voice small. "They're going to fire me, aren't they?" Louis didn't nod. He didn't shake his head. He simply said, I don't know. She pressed her back against the wall, staring past him. I've worked too hard for it to end like this. Then maybe you should have looked twice at her ticket, he said quietly. Or maybe just spoken to her like a person. She winced. It didn't feel like this before. Luis tilted his head. That's because no one ever challenged you before. She turned away, biting her lip. In first class, the energy shifted again when the cockpit door opened once more. The co-pilot stepped into the aisle, leaned toward the nearest crew member and whispered something. The flight attendant nodded and moved to the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your continued patience. We've received clearance to begin boarding procedures for the next flight shortly. In the meantime, we'll be preparing the cabin for disembarkation. Please remain seated until the seatbelt sign is turned off. But it wasn't just the usual message, the way it was delivered. The emphasis on the word disembarkation left people confused. They were still at the gate. No one had moved. Tasha turned her head slightly and noticed it too. From the galley, Ms. Parker stiffened. She knew exactly what that announcement meant. The flight wasn't taking off. It was ending. Outside the plane, a dark vehicle pulled up to the gate. It wasn't the usual luggage cart or food service truck. It was a black SUV with tinted windows and government plates. And beside it stood two uniformed security officers, one from the airline and the other from the FAA. Inside, Captain Monroe received the final confirmation through his headset. He turned to his co-pilot and nodded once. They're ready to come aboard. At the back of the plane, Ms. Parker leaned heavily against the counter, her knees weakening. Luis glanced at her again, but said nothing. There was nothing left to say. In seat 3B, Tasha glanced down at her phone one more time. A final message from Evelyn appeared. Security is boarding now. Stay seated. Don't speak unless asked. You've already said enough. And she had, without shouting, without demanding, without ever raising her voice. Tasha hadn't asked to be noticed. But now the entire plane was watching her, and the one person who had tried to silence her was about to be called out in front of everyone. The cabin door opened with a subtle click, but the energy it released felt anything but small. Every head near the front rows instinctively turned toward the sound. Two figures stepped onto the aircraft. A tall woman in a black FAA uniform, her expression unreadable, and a clean-shaven man in a dark suit with a badge clipped to his jacket. Neither of them smiled. Neither spoke a word as they walked briskly past the business class rows and entered the heart of first class. Passengers didn't know who they were, but they could feel it. This wasn't routine. This wasn't about a missing bag or a maintenance issue. This was something heavier, something official. Tasha sat still, watching them approach from the corner of her eye. Her expression never changed. No fear, no satisfaction, just calm. The FAA officer stopped at the row where she sat and looked down. "Miss Holloway?" she asked. Tasha turned her head slowly and nodded. "My name is Officer Rhodeses. I am here on behalf of Director Brooks. We'll be escorting you off the plane shortly. You'll be the last to disembark. Is that clear?" "Yes," Tasha said, her voice steady. The man in the suit added, "We'll also be detaining a crew member for questioning. Please remain in your seat until we call for you." With that, they turned and continued toward the galley. Back rows leaned forward. The whispering began almost immediately, passengers nudging each other with wide eyes and murmuring questions. Who was she? What did she do? What did the flight crew do? The answer walked out of the galley moments later, her face drained of all color. Miss Parker. She moved slowly, escorted by one of the airline supervisors and a uniformed security guard. She wasn't in handcuffs, but she might as well have been. The silence that followed her was suffocating. Every eye in first class was on her. The woman who had raised her voice hours ago now couldn't meet a single gaze. Her lips were pressed together tightly. Her eyes were locked forward. As she passed Tasha, she paused just for a second. She turned her head, eyes trembling, and met the girl's gaze for the first time since she'd sent her to the back of the plane. But Tasha didn't blink. She didn't look angry. She didn't look forgiving. She just looked back, and somehow that was worse. Miss Parker lowered her eyes and kept walking. The passengers didn't clap. They didn't cheer. They didn't say a word. But the shame in the silence was louder than applause. As she disappeared down the aisle, one passenger in business class leaned over to the man beside him and whispered, "She's the reason we never left the gate." Another added, She just ruined her whole career. Back in the galley, Miss Parker was led to the front door. She stepped off the aircraft, the bright lights of the terminal casting shadows across her face. And waiting for her, just beyond the glass wall, was a representative from the FAA's compliance division, a clipboard in one hand and an expression that meant business. Miss Parker had once prided herself on never being late, never losing control, never being the problem, but now she was the problem, and there would be no quiet exit. Inside the cabin, the intercom buzzed one last time. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll begin disembarkation shortly. Please remain seated until the seatbelt sign is off. A member of our team will guide you row by row. The passengers didn't move. They all waited, some with discomfort, some with curiosity, all with full understanding, now that what they had witnessed wasn't just a misunderstanding. It was a public reckoning. Luis walked down the aisle and stopped beside Tasha. "They'll call you when it's time," he said gently. She nodded. "I know." He lingered for a second, like he wanted to say something more, but in the end, he just gave a small nod of respect and walked away. Tasha leaned back in her seat, the plane now almost empty except for her and a few lingering crew members. The curtain had been pulled back, the secrets exposed. She hadn't shouted. She hadn't threatened. She didn't have to. One call, one truth, and the entire flight was grounded. Not because of turbulence, but because a system that had ignored too many voices for too long had finally been forced to listen. The last of the passengers were escorted off row by row, the quiet shuffle of footsteps echoing through the now half-empty aircraft. Most kept their eyes down, awkward and uncertain, the earlier confidence they carried at boarding long gone. Not a single person had the courage to speak to Tasha, not even those who had watched her humiliation and said nothing. And yet their silence now felt like something else entirely. Recognition, not pity, not guilt, just the uncomfortable awareness that they had witnessed a wrong and hadn't acted. That kind of silence carried weight. Tasha remained seated in 3B, her hands folded in her lap, the tray table still down with her phone resting atop it. She glanced at the dark screen again. No new messages. None were needed. Evelyn had said she'd take care of everything, and she had. Through the open curtain, Tasha could see part of the jet bridge now. A line of suited officials and staff waited beyond it. Some from the airline, some from the FAA. The black SUV was still parked below the terminal window, headlights faint against the concrete, its presence a clear signal. This flight would not be brushed off with paperwork. Inside the cabin, Captain Monroe stood by the cockpit door, arms crossed, watching the last few moments unfold. He hadn't said much throughout the flight, but he'd been paying attention. And now, as he looked at the girls still seated in first class, he understood something clearly. This was going to change the way they operated. Lewis returned to the cabin, this time with Officer Rhodes walking just behind him. "Miss Holloway," she said, her tone respectful but direct. "We're ready for you." Tasha stood up slowly. She didn't rush. She didn't glance around. She simply grabbed her bag from beneath the seat, slung it over her shoulder, and gave one last look at the cabin where everything had started. She had boarded quietly. She had followed the rules. She had taken her seat without causing trouble, and for that she had been stripped of dignity, challenged, and forced to move, to shrink, to disappear. But she hadn't. She'd stood her ground without shouting, and now she was walking out, not just as a passenger, but as the reason the entire industry would remember Flight 263. As she reached the galley, Louise stepped aside to let her pass. His voice was soft. "You handled that better than most grown adults would have." Tasha gave a small nod. "I didn't come to fight. I just came to fly." Louise didn't say anything more. He didn't have to. She stepped through the aircraft door and onto the jet bridge. The temperature shift hit her immediately, but she didn't flinch. On both sides, airline staff and compliance officers stood still, watching her walk past. No one blocked her. No one questioned her. They just moved aside quietly, letting her through as if they already knew who she was. At the end of the walkway, Evelyn stood waiting. No badge, no clipboard, no entourage. Just a calm woman in a navy trench coat and black heels. Her posture tall, her face unreadable. Tasha's pace didn't change. She walked right up to her and stopped. "You all right?" Evelyn asked. "I'm fine," Tasha said. "You want to talk about it?" Tasha shook her head once. "Not yet." Evelyn nodded, placing a firm hand on her shoulder. "You did exactly what you needed to do." They turned together and began walking down the terminal, away from the crowd, the officers, the whispers, behind them inside a small security room just off the gate. Miss Parker sat at a metal desk under bright lights. Across from her, an FAA investigator read aloud from a file. "Flight 263. You removed a minor with a valid boarding pass from a seat she was assigned to without verifying with ground control or flight manifest. Is that correct?" Miss Parker's voice cracked. "Yes. And what was the reason you chose to question her specifically?" Silence. The pen in the investigator's hand hovered above the paper. "I asked you a question," he repeated, calm but firm. Miss Parker swallowed. Her words were barely a whisper. She didn't look like a first-class passenger. There it was, truth stripped of excuse. The investigator's pen began moving. Inside the terminal, Evelyn and Tasha walked in sync. People passed them without noticing, faces buried in phones and flight monitors. But in one corner of the airport, a team of executives was already reviewing footage, policy documents, and statements from everyone on board. This wasn't going to be forgotten, and Tasha knew it. She didn't just get her seat back. She made the entire airline take a seat at the table of accountability. Not with noise, not with threats, but with truth. Later that evening, inside the headquarters of the airline's main terminal, a private meeting room glowed with soft overhead lights. The polished glass walls didn't hide the tension within. Around the large table sat members of the airline's executive board, legal advisors, operations managers, human resources leads, and the chief executive officer himself, Martin Raines. Each one of them had a thick folder in front of them. Inside, written testimonies from crew members, statements from passengers, the captain's in-flight report, and most importantly, the official FEOA compliance file. The room was silent except for the quiet flipping of pages and the occasional exhale of disbelief. "This incident has already reached internal media teams," one communications advisor finally said, "and trust me, it's not going to stay internal for long." The CEO didn't answer right away. He tapped a pen against the table, his gaze locked on the printed photo clipped to the front of the report. Miss Parker in uniform, standing rigid near the galley. "She was one of our longest-serving crew," he said slowly. "No major incidents, no recorded complaints." And yet the director of passenger affairs replied, "She forcibly removed a 16-year-old girl from first class after looking directly at a valid boarding pass. No scan, no manifest check, just her assumption." The room remained still. "And that girl," the CEO added, "she's not just a random passenger. She's the goddaughter of Evelyn Brooks, Director of Aviation Safety, one of the most respected names in FAA leadership. That's not just bad luck. That's institutional failure walking around in heels." A senior advisor cleared her throat and opened a new document. "We've reviewed the internal footage from the cabin. Audio wasn't captured, but passenger behavior confirms the story. No other first-class passenger was questioned, not one. And Ms. Holloway never raised her voice, never resisted." Another member of the board leaned forward. "We have a window here, a brief one, to correct this before it becomes national news." The CEO nodded slowly. "And Miss Parker, she's been suspended without pay, pending formal disciplinary review." The legal counsel confirmed. The FAA is expecting full cooperation, but based on the evidence, reinstatement is unlikely. There were no objections. The board began drafting an internal memorandum outlining a series of immediate changes. Among them, mandatory bias training for all flight crews, stricter rules for seat verification, a new protocol for handling complaints involving minors, and a direct reporting channel between the airline and the FAA for discrimination-related incidents. "This story is going to reach the public," one advisor added. "When it does, we'll need more than a press release." The CEO nodded. "We won't just apologize, we'll show people we changed something." Across the city, in a quiet hotel suite overlooking the runway, Evelyn sat on the couch with her laptop open. Her coat hung on the back of a chair, her shoes kicked off near the door. On the screen, she reviewed an early draft of the policy proposal she had already begun preparing. She had seen too many reports like this. Quiet stories swept away in folders, victims forgotten the moment they walked off a plane. But this time, it had been someone she loved, and that changed everything. Behind her, Tasha sat curled up in an armchair, wearing an oversized hoodie and clutching a warm cup of tea. The silence between them was soft, comfortable. "You don't have to go through all that tonight," Tasha said. After a while, Evelyn smiled faintly. "I'm not tired," Tasha glanced down at her cup. "You always said change is slow." "It is," Evelyn said, turning back to the screen. "But sometimes when someone's brave enough to speak up, even quietly, it speeds things up a little." Tasha didn't reply right away. Then after a pause, "I didn't feel brave." "You didn't have to," Evelyn replied. "You just had to tell the truth, and you did." Tasha leaned her head back against the chair and looked out the window. Down below, lights twinkled on the tarmac. Another plane took off, its nose lifting steadily into the night sky. Somewhere inside it, someone else was flying quietly, unaware of how close they were to being dismissed, to being judged, to being treated like they didn't belong. And maybe because of what happened today, they wouldn't be. Tasha sipped her tea and closed her eyes, letting the warmth settle in her chest. She didn't need an apology anymore. She didn't need headlines. What mattered was already happening. Changes were being written. Eyes had been opened. The flight hadn't taken off. But something else had. And this time, it wasn't grounded by power. It was lifted by truth. The next morning, the story broke. It started quietly, just a short article on an aviation blog posted at dawn. The headline was simple: FAA grounds flight over passenger complaint. Airline confirms internal review. At first glance, it read like standard travel news. But buried in the middle of the article was a sentence that would ignite a storm. Sources confirmed the passenger involved was a black teenage girl wrongfully removed from her assigned first-class seat by a senior flight attendant. FAA officials cite serious concerns regarding discriminatory behavior. Within hours, it spread. Larger media outlets picked it up. Industry reporters started reaching out for confirmation. One regional news station aired a segment before lunch. By noon, the airline's public relations team had issued a carefully written statement. "We are aware of an incident on Flight 263 involving one of our crew members and a first-class passenger. We are conducting a full investigation in coordination with the Federal Aviation Authority. Discrimination of any kind is against our values. The crew member has been placed on immediate suspension. We are reviewing our training and internal procedures to ensure this never happens again." But it wasn't enough. By mid-afternoon, video clips from passengers began circulating on social media. A few had captured the moment M. Parker was escorted off the plane. One video, just 15 seconds long, showed Tasha walking calmly down the jet bridge. A security officer following a few paces behind. No sound, just silence. And a row of stunned faces watching her leave. The clip exploded. Thousands of comments poured in. Some were outraged, others heartbroken. But most of all, people were tired. Tired of hearing the same kind of story. Different names, different faces, but the same pattern. A young black person questioned, humiliated, told they didn't belong. This time, the story didn't end with a public apology. This time, someone had stopped the entire plane, and the world noticed. At the same time, inside a conference room in the FAA's regional office, Miss Parker sat across from two compliance officers and an airline lawyer. Her uniform was gone. She wore a plain blouse, hair pulled back, eyes hollow. A recorder sat in the middle of the table, capturing every word. For the record, one officer said, "Can you confirm that you approached the passengers seated in 3B without request from the manifest ground agents or another crew member?" Miss Parker nodded faintly. "Yes, why?" "I thought she didn't belong there," she said. "I thought there had been a mistake. Did you verify that?" "No." The officer leaned forward. "What about her made you think she didn't belong?" Ms. Parker didn't answer. The silence stretched. Every second felt like a judgment all its own. "You understand," the officer added gently. "That's the core of this investigation. That moment, that choice." Monsieur Parker swallowed hard, staring down at her hands. "I've worked here for 10 years, she whispered. "I've seen people sneak into first class before. I thought I was protecting order. You weren't, the officer said. You were protecting assumption. The lawyer beside her said nothing, and she knew. There was no fixing this with a memo, no cleaning it up with, "I didn't mean to." That girl hadn't yelled. She hadn't broken a rule. She hadn't tried to sneak anything. All she did was sit in the seat her godmother had paid for, and that had been enough to trigger doubt. Now it had triggered a national response. At that very moment, across the country, airline staff were being pulled into emergency training briefings. Flight crews sat in rows watching new compliance videos on discrimination and bias. Pilots were handed revised manuals. Internal newsletters carried a stern directive from the CEO himself. We must become better, not later. Now, back in the hotel suite, Tasha scrolled through her phone, reading the headlines, the tweets, the messages. Some people were angry, some thanked her, some told her she was brave, others asked what she planned to do next. But she didn't want attention. She hadn't wanted any of this. She only wanted to take her seat like everyone else. Evelyn walked into the room with 2 mugs of coffee. "You're trending," she said, setting one down. Tasha didn't look up. "I saw." Evelyn paused. "You all right?" Tasha nodded. "It's just weird seeing people write about you like they know who you are." Evelyn sat across from her. "They don't have to know you. They just have to know what happened and why it mattered." Tasha finally looked up. "Do you think it'll change anything?" Evelyn didn't answer immediately. She took a sip of her coffee, then said, "It already has." And it had. The headlines might fade, the media might move on, but the policy changes, the training, the conversations happening inside the halls of power, those would last because a quiet girl on a plane had refused to be invisible. And now no one could look away. By the end of the week, the story had reached every major news outlet. National broadcasts debated it during prime time. Civil rights groups released statements. Hashtags trended on social media. Schools discussed it in classrooms. In airports across the country, employees whispered about it in break rooms, referencing it not by flight number, but by nickname. The grounded girl. It wasn't just the headlines that struck people. It was the silence of it all. The girl hadn't argued. She hadn't resisted. She hadn't shouted. She had simply told the truth, stayed seated, and made one call. That's what caught everyone off guard. That someone so young, so calm, could freeze an entire airline with nothing but quiet, dignity, and facts. News shows replayed the footage of her walking down the jet bridge. Podcasts dissected the timeline. An op-ed in the New York Times ran under the title, "She Didn't Belong, or You Didn't Want Her To." People started asking questions inside their own homes. Would I have spoken up if I were on that flight? Why did no one challenge the flight attendant? How many times has this happened without the world watching? But it wasn't just society watching now. The airline was watching too. Under the weight of public pressure and FAA oversight, an internal overhaul began. Ms. Parker's suspension became permanent termination. A formal announcement was made, citing a clear violation of passenger rights and company ethics. Her name, once respected in the aviation circles, now carried a legacy no one wanted attached to theirs. At corporate offices, mandatory bias training was no longer a yearly module. It became monthly, interactive, and monitored. A new whistleblower policy was implemented, protecting both passengers and crew who reported discriminatory behavior. Even boarding procedures changed. A 2-step verification process was created to prevent staff from questioning passengers based solely on appearance. Airline unions, initially quiet, stepped forward with suggestions of their own. A quiet revolution had begun, not just to save face, but to rebuild trust. And while the airline reshaped its image, a separate ripple spread through the public. Tasha had become a symbol, not a hero in a cape or a loudspeaker, but something even more powerful. A reminder that dignity doesn't have to be loud to be unshakable. Schools invited her to speak. Advocacy groups asked her to join panels. Journalists requested interviews. She turned most of it down. She didn't want to be a face for a movement. She just wanted to live her life again. One evening, Tasha and Evelyn sat at a small community hall where local teens gathered for weekly mentoring sessions. It wasn't a press event, no cameras, no speeches, just a room of young girls asking honest questions. One girl, no older than 15, raised her hand. "Were you scared?" she asked. Tasha looked at her for a moment, then nodded. "Yeah, a little." The girl leaned forward. "So how did you stay calm?" Tasha smiled gently. "Because I knew I didn't do anything wrong, and I knew someone had my back." The room went still. Evelyn, sitting just behind her, gave a faint nod of pride. That was the part people often missed. The power of being believed. The strength that rises not just from within, but from knowing someone on the outside won't let you be silenced. After the session, as the girls laughed and took photos with her, one of the organizers pulled Evelyn aside. "She doesn't realize it yet," the woman said quietly, "but she's already done more for them than we've done in years." Evelyn glanced over at Tasha, surrounded by smiling faces. "She doesn't want to be a symbol," she said. "She just wants things to be fair." "Well," the woman replied, "that's exactly why she's the right one." Later that night, in the quiet of their apartment, Evelyn placed a small envelope on Tasha's nightstand. Inside was a handwritten letter from the FAA, an official commendation recognizing her for the dignity, poise, and integrity she demonstrated under pressure. At the bottom was a handwritten note from Evelyn herself. "You didn't raise your voice, but you were heard louder than most ever are. I'm proud of you because you didn't just get your seat back. You reminded the world why you belonged in it to begin with." Tasha sat on her bed, reading those lines again and again, and as she leaned back against the pillow, eyes heavy with quiet thought, she realized. The flight may have never taken off, but her voice it carried. Weeks passed. The media cycle moved on, chasing newer headlines. Airports returned to their usual rhythm, hustling passengers, rolling luggage, quick announcements. On the surface, nothing seemed different. Flights boarded, seats filled, planes took off. But underneath, something had shifted. Inside the airline's headquarters, a new training video was added to the onboarding process. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't promotional. It was just a clear, calm reenactment based on Flight 263. At the end, a slide appeared on the screen. A valid ticket does not ask for approval. Respect isn't based on appearance. Bias has no seat on board. It was required viewing, and it wasn't optional anymore to pretend that kind of thing didn't happen, because it had, and it had left a mark they couldn't erase. Meanwhile, in a small high school auditorium 3 states away, a teacher paused her class and handed out printouts. "Today," she said, "we're going to discuss real-world consequences of assumptions and how one teenager made a global airline stop and listen." The printout read, "Case Study, Flight 263, How One Girl Grounded a System That Refused to See Her Back at Home." Tasha began easing back into her life. No cameras, no interviews. The sudden fame had died down, and she was grateful for it. She still rode the bus like she always had, still walked with earbuds in, hoodie over her head, unnoticed and ordinary. But there were changes, subtle, quiet ones. Once on a routine flight to visit her aunt, a flight attendant approached her with a calm smile. "Hi there," the woman said gently. "I just wanted to say, we read your story in training." Tasha looked up, surprised. The woman smiled again, more sincerely this time. "I just want you to know it made a difference for me, for a lot of us." Tasha nodded softly, unsure of what to say. She simply said, "Thank you," and the woman moved on, leaving behind a silence that felt warm instead of cold. And on that flight, no one questioned her seat. No one asked for her ticket twice. No one assumed she didn't belong. It was peaceful. Weeks later, Evelyn stood on a stage at an FAA leadership conference. The hall was filled with hundreds of policymakers, airline executives, safety directors, and crew leads. She wore a navy suit, her hair pulled back, her voice even and direct. She didn't name her daughter. She didn't share details. She just told the truth. She spoke about the cost of silent assumptions, about how the smallest power, left unchecked, could unravel someone's dignity in seconds. She reminded the room that the people most vulnerable to injustice weren't always the loudest, but they were always watching. And then she said this: "We talk a lot about turbulence in aviation. We train for storms. We prepare for system failures. But the most dangerous turbulence isn't in the sky. It's in our judgment. It's in the split-second decisions made without evidence. That's the kind that brings a system down." The room stayed silent when she stepped away, Not out of politeness, but because no one wanted to be the first to speak. After the speech, a young flight supervisor approached her quietly. "Director Brooks," he said, "that girl from Flight 263. Did she ever realize how big this became?" Evelyn looked at him with a smile that held both sadness and pride. "She didn't have to," she replied, "because she never did it for attention. She just wanted to sit in her seat in peace, and that wanting to be treated fairly is what made it powerful." That evening, Tasha sat on the porch with Evelyn, legs curled under her, sipping warm cider as the sun went down. The world was quieter now, safer maybe, not perfect, but changed in the ways that mattered. "I keep thinking about what that flight attendant said," Tasha murmured. Evelyn turned to her. "Which part?" "That I didn't look like I belonged." Evelyn waited, and now Tasha said, "Every time I walk into a room or step onto a plane or sit at a table, I don't wonder if I belong there anymore. I just sit." Evelyn smiled, eyes soft. "That's because you've always belonged." Tasha nodded, looking out at the fading light. She didn't need a stage. She didn't need revenge. What she had now was far greater. A seat she no longer had to fight for, and a world that would think twice. Because once a quiet girl made an entire system stop midair, not with a scream, not with a protest, but with one phone call. And the truth. The sky had always been open to her. Now finally, so was the respect. And it would stay open, not just for her, but for every passenger who would board a plane after her with nothing more in their hands than a ticket and the right to be treated like they belonged. If this story moved you, don't forget to like the video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories like this coming down.